Hey everybody, it's James, and if you notice something different, that's because I have my beautiful wife with me this time.
Hi everyone.
It's my beautiful wife, Shauna, um, and we're going to do this one together because we feel like it's important. We had some friends of ours who are either haven't been keeping the feast that long or considering keeping the feast and are just curious to basically ask us, quote unquote, how to do it. So this video is intended to be kind of a basic primer on, first off, what are the feasts of Yahweh. We're going to go into our Bibles. We're going to look at the texts that illustrate and outline where they come from, what we're supposed to be doing, and then we're going to, as we go through, just kind of talk about how we keep these feasts in 2020 America, and practical tips and pointers for anyone who's looking at doing it for the first time, or if you're a veteran professional who's been doing it for decades. We can always learn something. So that's basically what we're going to do, and we're going to try to make this interactive. We're going to open the floor for questions, but at the end. So please don't send us any comments while we're going with questions. Please do that at the end, and then we will. She's got her phone up, and I've got mine, so we'll take a look at the comments, and we'll try to address any questions that you have before we close it out at the end. So yay, I'm excited. All right. So we're going to get right into the text, and the bulk of this is going to come from Leviticus chapter 23. But we actually have commandments that start off prior to that. Starting in the book of Exodus, in chapter 23, it outlines three holy days, three feasts that the men of Israel are supposed to go to every year. These are called pilgrimage feasts. Starting in Exodus chapter 23, we're going to start reading in verse 14. 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in the year. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. That's in the spring. That's Passover, basically. You shall eat unleavened bread 7 days, as I commanded you, at the time appointed in the month of Abib. For in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty. And the feast of the harvest, the first fruits of your labors, which you have sown in the field, that's the feast of Shavuot, or Pentecost, like what we see in Acts 2. That's actually a fulfillment of this. And then verse 16. And the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you have gathered in the fruit of your labors from the field. That's the feast of Sukkot, the feast of tabernacles. That's the one that's relevant to this discussion today because that's in the fall. That's one of the fall feasts. 3 times in the year, all your males shall appear before Yahweh, your Elohim. And just a quick primer here for anybody that's not familiar with some of these terms. When you read your Bibles, generally speaking, and at least in the Old Testament, when you see the word Lord in all caps, capital Lord, the underlying Hebrew is going to have 4 letters, Yod He Wah He. That's typically pronounced Yahweh. That is, we find out when Moses goes to the burning bush and he asks God what his name is. He tells him that his name is Yahweh. His memorial name for all generations is Yahweh. So this is the formal, actual name of God. Okay, so we're going to use that as we go through our study here. And Elohim is a Hebrew term for God. It's more technically correct, but they're kind of interchangeable. So if those are strange to you, that's where they come from in the text. Okay. These are the feasts, and right away we get into a practical thing here. It's hard. I've never been able to do it. I've been keeping Yahweh's feasts since 2005, and I've never gone to Israel to do any of these because I just haven't been able to. So right away we have a practical consideration. If you can't go to Israel to keep these feasts, which it's generally assumed that Jerusalem is the place where Yahweh put his name, that's where you would go, then you can't do it, okay? If you can, and I know people that have over the years, I know people that go regularly every year if they can, then that's great. But most of us, it's just not possible. So we don't. Okay, so that's the first one. Now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of this, Leviticus 23. And I'm not going to read the whole chapter. I will start off by saying, I will start off reading the first couple of verses just to set up the context. And as far as, why believers, why Christians, or just believers in general in 2020 America should even be interested in these, because we've been taught historically that these are the feasts of the Jews. This is what the Jews do. Well, right off the bat, we have in Leviticus 23, and Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, The feasts of Yahweh, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts. So he makes clear right off the bat, these are his feasts. They're not our feasts. They're not the feasts of the Jews. They're not even the feasts of Israel. They're Yahweh's feasts. So if we can get our minds around that and recognize that, then if we are in alignment with him, then it makes sense to do his feasts, okay? And then he goes into detail things like the weekly Sabbath. He gets into the spring feast, Passover. But we're going to start reading for our purposes here in, where did it go?
23.
23. I knew I was getting close. Here we go. Verse 23. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall have a Sabbath rest, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it, and you shall offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh. So this is the first fall feast. This is the Feast of Trumpets, or in Hebrew, Yom Teruah. And the 7th month, it's important to note, if you're not familiar with the concept of a biblical calendar, we read earlier in Exodus about the month of Abib. The biblical calendar starts in the spring. Abib means green ears. So when things start to turn green in the spring, that's the first month. And a lot of other ancient cultures used to have the same thing. The Romans started their calendar in March for a while. March was the beginning of the year for the Romans. So that's an important concept. When we get into the 7th month, we're typically in September or October on the modern calendar. And a lot of people will, especially the Jews, will also consider this to be Rosh Hashanah, or the beginning of the year. Now, from our perspective, there's nothing in the scripture that says that. So we, as a family, do not observe it as the beginning of the year because it's the 7th month of the year. I mean, typically a year doesn't start 7 years into the year. 7 months into the year, thank you. So that's our logic. So we don't keep it as Rosh Hashanah, but we do keep it as the day of trumpets, or the Feast of Trumpets. And with the trumpets, I mean, this one's kind of a fun one. We have a lot of fun. Technically, when you look at that word for blowing of trumpets in the Hebrew, it doesn't even talk about necessarily blowing a trumpet. It's day of shouting. So what we do as a family is well, first off, I guess we should get into the calendar aspect of it just a little bit here. Since it's the first day of the 7th month, there's different ways to reckon that, okay? And if you're new to this, it's quite an adventure. The biblical calendar, some people will start it based on when they go out and sight the first sliver of the first new moon of that month. That's the method that we use. We go out and actually look for that very first crescent after the moon goes dark for a couple days at conjunction, and that triggers the beginning of the month. Others will actually go by the conjunction for the first day of the month. There are schools of thought that when you look for the moon, you do it from only Jerusalem, or potentially wherever you're at in the world. If you see it with your own eyes, that's when you do it. But either way you reckon it, it's that very first day of the 7th month is when you do it. And so what we do is we go out and see it, and if we can see it, we have our shofars. I don't have one handy. I should have grabbed one. And we just blow them, and the kids have fun, and we hope the neighbors are cool with us when it's done. And we shout, we'll usually shout Yahweh's name or something, and just a happy little time. And that's pretty much what we do as far as that commandment. And then we also, it talks about having doing no customary work. So, if you have a job, you take that day off. If it falls on a weekend, then it's convenient. But it's basically the same rules as the weekly Sabbath. You just don't do, any work. And then you have a holy convocation. And a holy convocation, people interpret that differently. The way we do it as a family, holy just means set apart. So you get together with other like-minded believers. You set yourself apart from the world for that day. You come together. Convocation has an underlying meaning of just reading the Word. So we get together with friends and family, and we go through and we read about the feast days. We'll pray. Sometimes we'll have a guitar or something out, and we'll do some songs. And we just try to have a nice family event, to make the day special and really set it apart. And that's really it in 2020 America. I mean, it does have commandments for offerings, for sacrifices, but we don't have a tabernacle or temple. And even if we did, there's no way to know who the Levites are. So it's impossible to keep those commandments. So we don't. We just focus on what we can do, and we do that to the best of our ability. So did you want to add anything before I move on?
For our family, since we have small children, I try to incorporate them as much as possible so that they have an understanding that's at their level, because sometimes reading the scriptures can be a little over their heads, so we try to bring it down to their level. So we sometimes do crafts, we do coloring pages, things like that. Each of the children have their own shofar, whether it be a real one or a plastic trumpet that I found online. We make a nice meal for the evening that we eat before we go out to sight the moon. It's not required that you eat before you go out, but that's what we do. Like James said, we go out and look for the new moon. The children blow their trumpets. We shout joyously. It's a day of shouting, and I'm trying to think here. This year we're making trumpet shofar shaped cookies for fellowship. The children like being involved in, making the foods that we take to fellowship, and they like to see their friends, and they're really excited to do the feast days. In fact, we have a countdown going on the refrigerator right now, and every day they look at it and they're like, "Mom, it's only so many more days until trumpets." Getting the children involved is really important, because we want them to understand and learn that this is not just our faith, meaning their parents' faith. We want them to have a personal relationship with this. We want them to understand why we do this, and we want them to be able to get into the scriptures themselves and see that, what we're trying to teach them is truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we like to see our friends too, so it's fun for us too. Okay, so the next one is the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, Yom Kippurim in the Hebrew. This one it's kind of ironic to call it a feast, because for most people it's not a feast. But this one is kind of a more somber occasion. And we find this in verse 27 of Leviticus 23. Also, the 10th day of this 7th month shall be the Day of Atonement. It shall be a holy convocation for you. You shall afflict your souls and offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh. And you shall do no work on that same day, for it is the Day of Atonement, to make atonement for you before Yahweh your God. For any person who is not afflicted in soul on that same day shall be cut off from his people. And any person who does any work on that same day, that person I will destroy from among his people. You shall do no manner of work. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. And it shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest, and you shall afflict your souls. On the 9th day of the month at evening, from evening until evening, you shall celebrate your Sabbath. So that's the Day of Atonement, and this is a little bit more involved than the Feast of Trumpets is. It's the 10th day of the 7th month, so you go 10 days after the Feast of Trumpets, and the main crux of this is the concept of afflicting your souls, and there's different interpretations on what that means, because in the Hebrew it's got a little bit of ambiguity to it. The typical interpretation is that word for soul has to do with like your appetite. So afflict your appetite. And this is where we get the concept traditionally of people fasting. Pretty much everybody Jewish fasts on this day, and most people who keep the Day of Atonement also fast all day. And there's different variations on that. Some people will not eat anything. Some people will just eat light. Some people will eat no food, but they will drink water. There's different things, to that. Now, for us, we 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 got to thinking like a few years ago because we used to do it as a fast, like no food, no water, nothing for the whole day, and for us, it got to the point to where the emphasis was on our bellies. I'm so hungry. I drink like a fish. I drink water all the time. I have to have some kind of fluids, water, coffee, tea, whatever. I have to have something. And so you end up just focusing, or at least for us, we ended up focusing just on how hungry we are. And because of that, we became aware that we were focusing on the flesh instead of our souls. So we made this determination, I guess it was about 3 years ago. Was it 3 years ago? I think it was. And to allow ourselves, and what we would do the night before, we would have kind of a light meal, nothing too heavy, and just to kind of get our bodies kind of ready for what was coming. And then the actual Day of Atonement, we would not have actual sit-down meals, so no breakfast, lunch, or dinner. But we do allow the kids and ourselves, if we get hungry, like actually legitimate hungry, to eat something light, like some salad or some fruit or just something kind of light like that, and and drink water whenever we need. So we're not focused so much on our bodies, and we spend the day reading through the commandments, and this is just something that we do. This is nothing that's in writing that we're supposed to do in the Bible. This is just something that we decided to do for us. We go through and we read Yahweh's commandments starting at Mount Sinai in Exodus 20, and we read as many as we can through the day. And we just take a good hard look at, are we doing this? First off, can we keep this commandment? If we can't, we move on. If we can, okay, are we doing it correctly? Is there room for improvement? Do we understand it correctly? And when you start to analyze, how you're living your life to Yahweh's standard, to his written code of conduct, if you will, and you start to see, maybe I'm making a mistake here, and it really does shine that spotlight on your inner being, on your soul. And so it makes it less about the flesh and more about the spirit. Um, at least that's kind of what we end up doing, and oftentimes we get so involved in that we just go hours and hours without even eating anyway. So we just kind of end up inadvertently fasting anyway, just because the focus is on our spirit and not on our bodies. So if you have, we know people who are diabetic, people with different health issues, where doing an actual fast is hard for them, if not impossible. And so it's our perspective that if you can't fast for any reason, then there's nothing in here that says you have to. So you do what you can. That's all he ever asks of us, is to do what we can, to do our best. He never asks for perfection. He doesn't ask us to do anything that's going to put us in harm or in danger. Um, and then it is a complete Sabbath. Do any work at all. So if it's during the week or whatever, you take the day off. And I've run into jobs before. I had a job once where they were fighting me on it, and thankfully Yahweh came through for me, and I had a supervisor who happened to be Jewish, which was cool. So she understood, hey, he's serious about this. He's not just sitting around watching football, or whatever. He's actually, he's got to be home to do this, and so it worked out, perfectly. So I mean, practically, that's really all we can do. There are offerings and stuff that go along with it. You've got the scapegoat and all that kind of stuff that they would do. But again, as before, we can't do that. It's impossible to keep that aspect of this holy day. So we don't even. I mean, we'll study it and we'll read about it, to kind of understand, what it means and the symbolism behind it and things. But it's nothing that we can actually do in 2020 America. So did you want to add anything before we?
I just, for us, before the Day of Atonement starts, we try to eat a larger meal so that we're not as hungry when we wake up. Our traditional menu includes soups, salads, fruits, foods that are very hydrating, lots of water. And then the next day, like James said, we don't set any specific breakfast, lunch, or dinner meal times until after the sun has set. If the children are hungry and they feel the need to have something to eat, they know that those are the things that they can have. That being said, we don't allow them to have sugar or juice or things that would be considered your typical feast day goodies, because that's not what the emphasis of this day is on either. Um, and then after the sun goes down and we've completed the Day of Atonement, we tend to indulge in a treat, something that we've um, been looking forward to. Maybe it's pizza or you know, whatever the case may be. And then we pretty much immediately set about getting ready for the Feast of Tabernacles, because that starts typically, 5 days after, on the 15th day of the month. But we tend to go early so that we can get set up, because the 15th day is a Sabbath. And I don't know if you've ever set up a camping and had to do tents and things like that for 6 people, but it's exhausting.
Yep.
So that's not really something that we've decided as a family to do on a Sabbath, even though there is a precedent in the scripture for assembling the booths on the first day, which James will get into here momentarily.
Yep. All right. And we even had one year where we were keeping the feast out of state, and we were on the road like at 1 o'clock the night after, like the sun went down to end Yom Kippur, and we were on the road heading out at like 1 o'clock that morning. I mean, we were.
No, we left at 9:30, but still.
I'm thinking of another thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're right. Yeah, it was 9:30.
We were driving at
But we
1 in the
had the
morning.
trailer and everything packed and ready to go before the Day of Atonement. That way we could just pretty much eat and then get in the car and go. So, but yeah, it's kind of ironic because you hear people say, "Oh, Happy Day of Atonement," and it's like, oh, it's not really supposed to be a happy day, but Okay, so now we get to the fun one, I guess. This is the one that everybody looks forward to every year, the Feast of Tabernacles. And this one starts in verse 34, Leviticus 23, verse 34. Speak to the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of this 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days to Yahweh. On the first day there shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. For 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh. On the 8th day you shall have a holy convocation, and you shall offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh. It is a sacred assembly, and you shall do no customary work on it. These are the feasts of Yahweh, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, to offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh, a burnt offering and a grain offering, a sacrifice and drink offerings, everything on its day. Besides the Sabbaths of Yahweh, besides your gifts, besides all your vows, and besides all your freewill offerings, which you give to Yahweh. Also on the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the fruit of the land, you shall, because earlier in Exodus we talked about, it's called the Feast of Ingathering as well. You shall keep the feast of Yahweh for 7 days. On the first day there shall be a Sabbath rest, and on the 8th day a Sabbath rest. So it is a 7th day feast, but it's got an 8th day tacked onto it. And it's interesting because it makes this kind of symmetry with the Feast of Passover and Unleavened Bread in the spring, because with that you have Passover starts, and then you have the Day of Unleavened Bread that starts the following day for 7 days. So you have a 1 plus 7, and then in the fall you have a 7 plus 1. So it kind of makes it kind of fun, kind of easy to kind of remember how it's kind of set up.
Mirror image.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, mirror image. And verse 40, you shall take for yourselves on the first day the fruit of beautiful trees, branches of palm trees, the boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before Yahweh your Elohim for 7 days. You shall keep it as a feast to Yahweh for 7 days in the year. It shall be a statute forever in your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths or tabernacles, temporary, basically tents, for 7 days. All who are native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh your God. So Moses declared to the children of Israel the feasts of Yahweh. So he caps it with the beginning of the chapter and the end of the chapter. These are the feasts of Yahweh. They're not the feasts of the Jews. They're not the feasts of anybody. They're the feasts of the Most High. Okay, so this one's really fun. Basically, the first day and the 8th day are Sabbaths, just like any Sabbath. You don't work, you rest. It doesn't necessarily talk about it here. I think it's implied with the branches and stuff that that's what you make your dwelling out of, and it talks about doing that on the first day. So that's what she alluded to earlier, where she said, there's implication that you can actually build your dwelling on the first day, even though it's a Sabbath. But just functionally, it's when you got a family of six and everything, it's better just to get it done ahead of time if you can. That way you can actually rest on that Sabbath because you need it after setting up, especially if it's raining, which it often does. Okay, so I was going to touch on something here. Again, there's offerings. We can't do the offerings, so we just roll on by that one. But the fun thing is that you're commanded to rejoice before Yahweh. So it's one of those things to where we often hear that the commandments are oppressive and they're bondage and everything, and they're so hard, and yet here we are commanded to rejoice before our Maker. So I'm happy to keep that commandment. Personally, I like to rejoice. Okay, so yeah, the branches. I guess I'll go into detail on the branches a little bit here, because it's implied that you make your sukkah out of this. In the old days they would actually build stick structures, but people will take, and it's kind of more of a tradition, I think, but people will take these types of branches and they'll do things like they'll dance with them, and they'll just even if you have a tent, they'll just use these branches to decorate the tent or whatever. The idea is to incorporate them in somehow as part of your rejoicing as you keep the feast. Okay. I'm gonna look at the notes here and make sure I don't get off track. That's an awesome thing about having my wife here with me, is she's really good at keeping me on track, because I can be really scatterbrained sometimes. Okay, did I miss anything? Oh yeah. Okay, so some practical considerations, and I've had to deal with some of these myself. What if you have to work? Okay, because it's a week-long thing. You can take a day off for trumpets, maybe. You can take a day off for Day of Atonement, but we're talking about taking 8 days minimum off in one block. What if for some reason you can't do that because of your job? Well, you only have to take off the first and eighth day. Those are the Sabbaths. So in the middle of that, you don't have to rest. So we've had occasions where I couldn't take the whole time off. I didn't have enough vacation time built up or whatever. So it wasn't the most fun, but we would go ahead and set up camp for the whole time anyway. And I would just commute back and forth, for the days during the week, and then take off for the high days, the first day and the eighth day, because even if one of them falls on the Sabbath, it's possible that you could have them both fall on the Sabbath, which has happened before. But
I'm on track for this year too.
Oh, hopefully that would be nice. So I would just commute back and forth, and she would stay there with the kids. We made it work. Okay, so if that's something that's on the table for you, don't sweat it. It can be done. Okay, and there's nothing wrong with having to do that. You just do the best you can. That's the whole thing. Do the best you can. If you can't camp for whatever reason, if there's no camping in your area, the camp that you decided kind of later in the year that you wanted to do this, and the campsites are all booked. That's happened to people before. Again, do the best you can. If you live in town, you can put a tent up in your yard. If you live in an apartment complex, there have been people who will put up some kind of small something on their balconies, and do it that way. Just something, just something to get in some kind of a temporary tent-like edifice, for the week. If you end up,
it's about remembering.
Yeah, it's about remembering the Exodus from Egypt. Because in Egypt they had permanent dwelling places in Goshen before they left. They actually had houses, and so now they're out in the wilderness for 40 years. In just tents, or they're just making stick structures whenever they're able to. So it's to remind us of that, and basically to remind us of Yahweh's deliverance and provision for His people. And then if you're alone, it's not ideal, but it does happen sometimes. You just do what you can. There's nothing wrong with keeping it, and to take it back to staying home, we had our son was actually born on the first day of the feast, And so having a newborn child and everything, we couldn't camp that year. We were actually going to camp in our yard, and we just couldn't make it work.
It was very cold. There
It was
was
cold,
ice
yeah.
and frost that year, so
So
we camped out in the living room.
we stayed in our house, So you do the best you can. That's all he asks. And I won't read it, but I'll give you the scripture reference. There is a actual precedent for keeping it on your roofs if you live in town, and that's in Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 13 through 18. If you want to read up on that, when the house of Judah, when the Jews came back from the Babylonian captivity and they kept that feast for the first time, they decided to do it at the last minute. They didn't have any time to prepare. So you had people who were setting up in the countryside around Jerusalem. People were setting up on the rooftops because back then all the houses had flat roofs with what's the word? I was going to say partitions, but fences or walls around the roof to keep you from falling off. In the courtyard, the town square, anywhere that they could, they would set up and they would do it. So there's precedent for doing it that way. Okay. And then, another thing, let's go to Deuteronomy. And this is one that not a lot of people do, but I do think it is important. Deuteronomy 31, and we'll read, we'll start in verse 9. And I gotta go back one more page. Okay. So Moses wrote this law and delivered it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who bore the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, and to all the elders of Israel. And Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, at the appointed time, in the year of release, at the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before Yahweh your God in the place which he chooses, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Gather the people together, men and women and little ones, and the stranger who is within your gates, that they may hear and that they may learn to fear Yahweh your God and carefully observe all the words of this law, and that their children who have not known it may hear and learn to fear Yahweh your God as long as you live in the land which you cross the Jordan to possess. So the commandment is to and we won't get into it here in this one, but that you have the Sabbath year. Every 7 years, the land gets a rest. You don't plant anything, and it's a remission of debt. If you have a servant, that servant can be released in that year. That's where we get the concept of a bondservant, someone who chooses to stay when they can be released. During that year, at that feast, you actually read the law, the Torah, Yahweh's commandments in front of everybody. So everybody's there, everybody's able to hear it, because they didn't have, bookstores like we have now where you can get a King James Bible or a New American Standard or whatever. They didn't have, iPhones with Blue Letter Bible app or anything. So, the average person didn't have access to written word. This was their one shot, basically, to hear it.
Not everyone could read.
Not everyone could read, yeah. So this was your one shot, and we see Ezra doing this in the book of Ezra. Ezra reads the law. He was fulfilling this commandment. People don't really know generally where we're at in this Sabbath cycle. There's debate on it. So people I know they'll just read it every year. And typically they just read the book of Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy is kind of a summary of the Torah. The stuff we find in Exodus, Numbers, and Leviticus is kind of summarized in Deuteronomy. So people will just read Deuteronomy. So there's that. That's the biblical basis for the Feast of Tabernacles. Now we get to the fun part. I'm going to turn my wife loose, and she's going to break down the practical nuts and bolts stuff that we do every year for this. So prepare to be amazed.
Well, I'll just give a quick rundown of what we do. Basically, from one feast to the next, planning starts for me right after the last feast ends. So I do take a little break over the winter, but over the years, I've assembled a binder, Feast of Tabernacles plan book, what you might call a Martha, very much into schedules and planning, and I try not to be surprised, and I try to get as many things done as possible to make the feast smooth and fun and relaxing for everyone, including myself, because generally speaking, this is the only vacation that that we get in a year. So basically, I print out a calendar to put in this book. I schedule what needs to be done, how far in advance we need to pack, what we need to pack based on the season. Generally speaking, the feast is usually mid to late September all the way to mid to late October. So that's a huge swing in seasonal temperatures. We've had feasts where it was 95 degrees, then we went swimming, and we've had feasts where it was freezing cold, and we sat chattering around the fire trying to stay warm. So you kind of have to keep an eye on things and be prepared for anything, basically. We camp in a tent. This will be my 21st Feast of Tabernacles. I started keeping, actually keeping the Feast of Tabernacles in 2000. My parents raised me, I guess, starting like around 7 or 8. And I have vague memories of just setting up a tent in the backyard. So a lot of these ideas that I've adopted have been fine-tuned over the years, passed down to me, from my parents' experience, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The number one thing that you should remember is to try to stay dry, keep things dry, invest in a good tent, so that you're not miserable, because 9 times out of 10, it will rain at least once during the Feast of Tabernacles, if not more. Last year when we tore down, it was in the middle of a downpour, and everything was soaked. And by the time we got home, we were ready to be back in our dwelling. So plastic totes that you can get from the dollar store or Walmart, really important to keep your clothes dry. You want to keep your feet dry, because cold feet make for a cold, chilled body. Basically, just have fun, The second tip I'll give is, if you're not camping in your backyard and you're looking for a place to go, if you go with a group, that's great. They've probably already scoped out the basic necessities that make for a little bit easier feast. My number one requirement for a campground is good bathroom facilities.
Yeah. Makes a big difference.
We've been to campgrounds where the showers were coin operated, where they had no hot water, where we had to rig up a bungee cord system just to keep the water running so you could wash your hair. Porta potties, really scary bathroom facilities. So when you're away from home for 8 to 10 days, that's my number one requirement, is what do the bathrooms look like? Then we'll look at the tent sites, and see what amenities they offer. That being said, in 2020 America, we can afford to be a little choosy, because this is a remembrance of what we were doing. Whereas, the children of Israel wandering around in the wilderness, they kind of just went wherever Yahweh told them to go, and they didn't get to choose their bathroom facilities or their tenting accommodations. So, when the pillar of fire or cloud said move, they just got up and went. I will say that state parks are generally more conducive to feasts, if you're trying to get away from the worldly aspect of celebrations like Halloween, because inevitably, starting in September, most privately owned campgrounds do some sort of Halloween activity every weekend, and you're pretty much guaranteed to be camping over at least one weekend. So if you don't want your young, impressionable children being scared half to death by the worldly activities going on around them, then I suggest finding a campground that doesn't host activities in such a manner. Trying to think of what else.
I do want to interject though. Like we've been talking about tents, and a lot of people will do it in an RV, a motorhome, something like that. That's fine. I mean, who are we to say what you can and can't do? Do what you can, right?
One day I dream of having an RV.
Exactly.
So that I can be nice and dry.
Places have cabins. We've known people who have rented cabins for the week and stayed in a cabin. So I mean, if you can't do a tent, I mean, we know people who can't do a tent for health reasons. They have bad backs, things like this where they just cannot sleep in a cot. They can't sleep on the floor, and I mean they just can't do it. Even in an air mattress, because an air mattress is, let's just face it, they're not a real bed, right?
No, they're not. And we've tried out pretty much every air mattress on the market, and none of them live up to what they promised, with the exception of one, I think it was, and we're in no way affiliated with this company at all. I think it was Fox's
F-O-X-X.
Air beds. They've lasted the longest. Your cheapy ones from Walmart are pretty much a bad investment.
Yep.
Like, don't even waste your money. You're better off just sleeping on the ground with a mattress pad.
Because you end up doing it anyway, in our experience.
This is true. This is true. As you go about your feast observances year after year, you kind of add a little bit to your collection. You kind of figure out what works and what didn't. For us, the big thing is to have a sleeping area and then a kitchen area. Because of the rain, you want to be able to have a dry place to eat your food. And so we have what we call a kitchen tent. And don't laugh, but I think it was 3 years ago, we added a mini fridge to our collection, just because when we have sites that have electricity, it's a lot easier to just plug in a small fridge to keep your food cold instead of having to run for ice, especially during those hot Sukkot where it melts literally within hours.
Yeah.
So, I'm more of a stay at my site and rest and relax, because, like I said, it can be as easy or as difficult in planning as you make it. I tend to probably go overboard a little bit in the planning department. So I'm ready to just sit in my camp chair and relax around the campfire. But, my children like to go play at the playground or find hiking trails or, things like that to do. So a lot of people will make day trips, like perhaps you're camping in an area where there's museums or other state parks or activities to do. You spend the time together as a family. You go and enjoy yourself. You rejoice before Yahweh.
Well, you mentioned campfires. Campfires is one of the best parts, especially if you're camping with other families, because you get a good campfire going in the evening. People are sitting around, just talking, just having fun, telling jokes, telling just funny stories, and you really get to know these people. You really get to know who are these people that you're fellowshipping with, like as people. And we've developed a lot of great friendships over the years just around the campfire. You have, because you're gathered with like-minded believers. You're gathered with people who are there because they want to do what the Word of Yahweh says. You often find yourself just having spontaneous Bible studies just out of nowhere.
Those are some of the best.
Hey, let's just crack our Bibles and sit around.
Bible discussions we've had.
And you just dig deep. You just bounce stuff off each other. There's no script. I mean, some people. So, and we've done both ways. We've gone to tabernacles where the people who have organized it, want more structure, to where you have organized services daily or something, or maybe the host will want to do like a specific teaching or a sermon type thing. But anymore, we just prefer just to leave it kind of more loose, kind of more organic, and just kind of let it flow how it does, and then that way, nobody has a burden to try to feel like, oh, I've got to get this teaching done by Thursday, and because you're supposed to rejoice before Yahweh, not be stressed out all week. So,
that being said, on the high days and the Sabbaths, try really hard to have that holy convocation that we're commanded to do, and gather together with the other families that you may be camping with, or if you're camping by yourself and it's just your family, then which we've done before too, where it's just us, and we'll just sit at the picnic table with the children, and we'll go over the scriptures, read about the feast days, ask them if they have any questions, things like that. I also try to bring crafts for them to do.
Last year was epic.
Yeah. A great crowd pleaser for children are edible sukas. They're kind of like the gingerbread houses for Sukkot, and you use graham crackers and peanut butter, and you stick them together, and then you can add whatever your heart desires. Last year, some of them ended up just looking like peanut butter and candy glued to a plate because that's what they wanted to eat. And some of them were a bit more creative, but that tended to get a little more intricate as the age level progressed. They were more interested in the actual craft than the getting to eat the candy. So, but yeah, that's pretty much just the basics. I pull out my plan book usually in August, depending on when the feast is projected to be, and just go through, figure out, where we're going to camp. Although usually we like to have that figured out by Passover. Of course, this year things were a little more difficult, and we weren't sure that we'd be able to go anywhere. We were discussing just camping in our yard this year. We are planning to camp, in our area, and see what happens between now and then. So, of course, you get your grocery list together, and there's 6 people in our family, so it's like, okay, clothes and shoes and toiletry items and just things that you need, umbrellas, rubber boots, raincoats. Those are huge, and depending on what the weather does between now and then, we may be adding, coats and hats and things like that to our list. So I try to make a packing list for each person, and then check things off as we go so that they know what they need to pack, and I know what's been packed, so we don't duplicate our efforts and end up taking too much, which sometimes happens anyway. And a note about food: whatever you think you're going to need, cut it in half, because for some reason their food multiplies, especially when you're keeping the feast with other people. There's such a sense of family and camaraderie that, if you're like, oh, I forgot a tomato for my taco night, and somebody's like, oh, here, I've got 5, or, one year someone forgot pillows, and I just happen to have extra pillows, and it's, you share, and you're part of this, large family where, everyone's just happy to be together.
The kids love it, and I will just kind of, I guess, try to kind of wrap up the whole thing like on a theological point. Like, we read in Leviticus 23 that these are the feasts of Yahweh that were given to the children of Israel. And I mentioned how they're not the feasts of the Jews. So if you consider yourself a follower of Yahweh, of the Most High, especially when we factor in what Paul said in Romans 11 about being grafted into Israel, when we read about what he said in Ephesians 2 about being part of the commonwealth of Israel once you believe in Messiah, these are key concepts here. So, if you're grafted into that tree, that olive tree of Israel, then, just from a pure theological standpoint, these feasts are directed towards that. They're directed towards Israel. So if that's you, if you're grafted into that tree, these are the feasts that Yahweh himself said he wanted his people to keep. So it's as somebody who's done Christmas, who's done Easter, who's done all the mainstream Christian holidays and transitioned over to this as an adult, I can tell you from my own personal experience that doing Yahweh's holy days is a much more rewarding and satisfying experience just from an all-around perspective, but especially spiritually, to know that you're actually doing the things and living what's in your Bible, as opposed to things that are not in your Bible, things that might be loosely based on the Bible, but you don't actually find them spelled out in your Bible. It's a game changer. And the kids, if you have kids, our children have never kept Halloween. They've never done any of that stuff. They've been doing this from birth. So, we often hear people say, well, Halloween and all that stuff is fun, and Christmas and everything is fun. What about the kids? Kids are kids. Kids are going to have fun no matter what. So if you transition your children from one set of holidays to a set of holy days, then the kids will find a way to have fun. So don't let that be a detriment. If this is something that you're interested in, transitioning your family, the kids do adjust. And we've seen, like Shanna mentioned, that she did this when she was a kid. And, she's been doing it, the whole time. And we know families who have made the adjustment. And, we know families who for the first 2 or 3 years, they'll do both. They'll do Christmas, they'll do Easter and stuff, but they'll also do the biblical feast days, kind of like a weaning process. And then eventually the whole family transitions over to the biblical feast days. And, however you need to do it for your family and for your circumstances, just do the best you can. Just do what you can do, and, don't fear judgment from anybody. You got to walk your own path. You've got to do your own thing. But from our perspective, trying to do that thing Yahweh's way is much more
easier.
rewarding, and it is, because we have a written blueprint in our Bibles for what to do, as basically a framework, and anything beyond that is just what your family does, whatever your family traditions are, whatever you guys do for fun, and except for Day of Atonement, we don't have fun on that day. Anyway, so I think that's all we had to run through. So like we mentioned at the beginning, at this point, we'll open the floor up. If anybody has any questions, let us know in the comments. We'll take a look at those and try to answer them the best we can. If you don't have anything in mind now and we end up closing the stream, still feel free to ask us those questions later. You can maybe private message us or maybe comment on the video later or whatever, and we'll see if we can address it somehow. But yeah, any questions, comments?
So a basic recap: Feast of Trumpets.
Yep.
Make noise, rejoice. Day of Atonement, afflict your soul. Make sure you're right with Yahweh. And then prepare to enter into the season of your joy, of His joy, with the Feast of Tabernacles, and rejoice before Yahweh.
Yep.
Camp, eat, hang out with people, read your scriptures.
Yep. And revel in the fact that you are called out, of this crazy, insane world to be set aside to Yahweh. That's, to me, that's the biggest thing, because especially. And he doesn't get into it with these fall feasts, and I guess I will kind of go into a little side point here, but there are some things that he specifically says are signs between him and his people, and one of them is the Feast of Passover, which is a spring feast. We'll probably have to do this again at some point for the spring feast, because this is kind of, I'm enjoying this. This is fun. And then the other one is the weekly Sabbaths. Okay, the weekly Sabbath is the easiest thing to keep. I mean, you take the seventh day of the week off, Saturday, you rest, and you have a holy convocation, so you take a day off from work if you're not off already, get together with your family, get together with some friends, read the Bible, get the guitar out, the piano out, praise the Almighty, things like this, and that's pretty much it for Sabbath. I mean, it's so easy. It's so easy, and doing those things. Yahweh specifically says, set you apart from the rest of the world, So it's like, I've done the example with pencils and paper clips and stuff. You have 5 pencils, you pull one to the side, you have just set apart that one to the side. In other words, you've made it holy, because they're holy convocations. So by doing things differently from the world, by doing things Yahweh's way, you are setting yourself apart. You are setting yourself aside for Him. You are engaging in holiness. And yeah, I just can't imagine a more rewarding, thing to do. But I'm not seeing any questions coming through, at least on my phone. Do you see them coming through on yours?
Nope.
Okay. Well, I guess rather than just sit here and babble for the next 10 minutes, waiting for people to ask questions if they have them, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Like I said earlier, if you do have questions after the stream, let us know anyway. I don't know if we'll do a second stream later coming on to address those. If we get enough, we might, but if it's just one or two, maybe just private messages or whatever. But unless you have anything else to add, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap it up. We hope you guys have an awesome week, and thank you for tuning in, and Yahweh bless.